Story 1. The Hitchhiker Who Wouldn't Leave. Kevin Ramirez had been driving commercial trucks for 14 years, ever since he graduated from a technical driving school in Phoenix at the age of 22. Now 36, he'd built a solid reputation as a reliable driver who could handle difficult routes and tight deadlines without complaint. Kevin worked for a large national carrier based out of Nevada, primarily hauling electronics and consumer goods between distribution centers across the western United States. The work was steady, if not particularly exciting, involving mostly interstate driving on well-maintained highways, with predictable schedules and reasonable expectations. On a cool October evening in 2017, Kevin was driving northbound on Highway 93 through the remote stretches of central Nevada, hauling a load of computer components from Las Vegas to Boise, Idaho. This particular stretch of highway was notorious among truckers for its isolation and monotony, cutting through hundreds of miles of high desert with only occasional small towns breaking up the endless landscape of sagebrush and alkali flats. Cell phone service was spotty at best, and radio stations faded in and out as you drove beyond range of their transmitters. Most drivers found the route hypnotic and exhausting, requiring constant focus to avoid the dangerous trance that could come from staring at empty highway for hours. Kevin had departed Las Vegas around 4 in the afternoon, planning to drive through the night and arrive in Boise by mid-morning the following day. The weather was clear and cool, perfect conditions for making good time on the empty highway. As sunset painted the desert sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Kevin settled into the rhythm of the drive, listening to a playlist of classic rock songs and occasionally checking his mirrors and gauges out of long-practiced habit. Traffic was virtually non-existent, with Kevin seeing perhaps 1 or 2 vehicles every 20 minutes. Mostly other commercial trucks making similar runs through the lonely landscape. Around 9:30 p.m., roughly 60 miles north of the small town of Tonopah, Kevin's headlights picked out a figure standing on the shoulder of the highway. A man in his mid-20s or early 30s based on his build and posture, wearing jeans, hiking boots, and a heavy jacket against the desert night's chill. His thumb was extended in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker seeking a ride. As Kevin's truck approached, the man waved urgently, his expression desperate in the brief illumination of the headlights. Kevin's first instinct was to ignore the hitchhiker and continue driving. Company policy strictly prohibited picking up riders, and Kevin had always followed that rule without exception. The liability issues alone were enough to discourage the practice, not to mention the potential safety risks of allowing a stranger into your vehicle in the middle of nowhere. But something about the man's desperate waving gave Kevin pause. Breaking down in this part of Nevada at night could be genuinely dangerous, with temperatures dropping into the 30s and the nearest town being dozens of miles away. If this person was stranded with a broken-down vehicle, he could be in real trouble. Against his better judgment and in violation of company policy, Kevin began slowing his truck. He pulled onto the shoulder about 50 yards past where the hitchhiker stood and applied his air brakes. In his side mirror, Kevin watched the man jog toward the truck, moving with a strange, loping gait that seemed slightly unnatural but could have been attributed to fatigue or cold. Kevin rolled down his passenger window as the man reached the cab, preparing to offer to call for roadside assistance rather than actually providing a ride. "Thank God you stopped," the man said, his voice rough and strained. "My car broke down about 10 miles back. I've been walking for hours. Can you give me a lift to the next town?" Up close, the hitchhiker looked even more desperate than he'd seemed from a distance. His face was gaunt and pale, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested exhaustion or illness. His clothes, while appearing warm enough, were oddly outdated in style, reminiscent of fashions from the 1980s or early 90s rather than current trends. Kevin hesitated, his rational mind screaming at him to refuse and drive away. but his compassion winning out. "I can't really take passengers," Kevin explained. "Company policy, but I can call someone for you, get a tow truck sent out to your vehicle." The hitchhiker's expression shifted subtly, the desperation taking on an edge of something else, something that Kevin couldn't quite identify but that made his skin prickle with unease. "Please," the man said, and his voice now had a quality that was almost hypnotic, compelling. "I just need to get to the next town. It's not far. Nobody will know. Please, I can't stay out here another night." There was emphasis on those last words. Another night. That suggested the hitchhiker had been stranded for longer than he'd initially indicated. Kevin found himself nodding agreement before he'd consciously decided to do so, reaching over to unlock the passenger door. The hitchhiker climbed up into the cab with surprising agility for someone who claimed to have been walking for hours. He settled into the passenger seat and immediately pulled the door closed with more force than necessary, the slam echoing in the quiet night. "Thank you," he said, turning to look at Kevin with eyes that seemed to reflect the dashboard lights in an odd, almost animal way. "You have no idea how long I've been waiting for someone to stop." Kevin put the truck back in gear and pulled onto the highway, accelerating to cruising speed. The cab suddenly felt smaller, more confined, with the presence of the stranger beside him. Kevin tried to make conversation, asking the standard questions about where the hitchhiker was from and where he was heading. The man's answers were vague and sometimes contradictory, mentioning towns that Kevin had never heard of despite his years of driving through Nevada. When Kevin asked about the man's broken-down vehicle and whether he wanted to arrange for its recovery, the hitchhiker just stared at him silently for several long seconds before saying, "It's been taken care of." The next town of any size was Ely, approximately 90 miles north of their current position. Kevin explained that he could drop the hitchhiker there, but the man shook his head firmly. "I need to go further. I need to go all the way to where you're going." This statement alarmed Kevin considerably. He'd never mentioned his destination, and there was no way for the hitchhiker to know he was headed to Boise. When Kevin pointed this out, the man just smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes and revealed teeth that seemed somehow wrong, too white and too uniform, like dentures or prosthetics. "I can see your route in my mind," the hitchhiker said matter-of-factly. "I can see lots of things. I can see that you're starting to regret picking me up. I can see you wondering how to make me leave. But I can't leave, Kevin. Not until we reach the end of the road together." The use of Kevin's name, which he definitely had not shared, sent ice water through Kevin's veins. His hands tightened on the steering wheel and he glanced at the passenger beside him with growing fear. The hitchhiker was staring straight ahead through the windshield now, his profile illuminated by the dashboard lights. In this angle and lighting, Kevin could see that the man's skin had an odd texture, almost waxy or artificial. The man wasn't blinking, hadn't blinked once since climbing into the truck, and now that Kevin was paying attention, he realized the hitchhiker's chest wasn't moving with breathing. Whatever was sitting in his passenger seat, Kevin was becoming increasingly certain it wasn't entirely human. Kevin considered his options. He was driving 70 miles per hour on a dark highway in the middle of nowhere. He couldn't simply stop and demand the hitchhiker get out, not without potentially putting himself in physical danger. His cell phone showed no signal, eliminating the option of calling for help. The next town was still over an hour away, and Kevin wasn't sure he could endure that much time trapped in the cab with this increasingly disturbing presence. "What are you?" Kevin finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The hitchhiker turned to look at him, and in the brief moment their eyes met, Kevin saw something vast and incomprehensibly old, looking back at him from behind the human mask. "I'm a passenger," the thing said. "I've always been a passenger. I ride with drivers like you, moving from place to place, seeing the world through your routes and your schedules. Sometimes I ride for miles, sometimes for years. It depends on the driver and how long they last. Kevin felt his blood turn to ice. How long they last, he repeated, his voice shaking. The hitchhiker smiled that wrong smile again. Driving is dangerous, Kevin. Accidents happen. Trucks leave the road. Drivers fall asleep at the wheel. Heart attacks, strokes, so many ways a journey can end badly. And when a driver is carrying me, well, the probability of those unfortunate events increases significantly. It's not that I cause them exactly, I just attract misfortune. I'm a magnet for tragedy. For the next hour, Kevin drove in silent terror, every mile feeling like 10, every moment expecting something catastrophic to happen. The hitchhiker sat motionless beside him, occasionally making observations about the landscape or asking questions about Kevin's life that the thing couldn't possibly know the answers to without some form of supernatural knowledge. Kevin learned that the hitchhiker claimed to have been riding with truckers for over 80 years, since the early days of long-haul trucking in the 1930s and 40s. It had witnessed countless accidents, had been present for numerous driver deaths, and had walked away from crashes that should have killed anyone in the vehicle. The entity explained that it fed on the fear and desperation of drivers who realized too late that they'd picked up something inhuman. It sustained itself on those emotions, growing stronger with each terrified mile. Some drivers lasted hundreds of miles before their fear drove them to fatal mistakes. Others, stronger-willed individuals, had managed to carry the hitchhiker for days or even weeks, their terror building slowly until it reached a crescendo that inevitably ended in disaster. Kevin's mind raced, searching for any way to survive this nightmare. The hitchhiker had made it clear that forcing it out of the truck wouldn't work, that it would simply reappear inside the cab regardless of locks or physical barriers. Kevin couldn't outrun it or fight it or reason with it. The entity existed beyond normal physical laws, and it had chosen Kevin as its current host, its current source of fear and suffering. Then Kevin remembered something from his childhood growing up in a Catholic family in Phoenix. His grandmother had been deeply religious and had taught him prayers and rituals for protection against evil. At the time, Kevin had dismissed it all as superstition, but now, facing something that defied rational explanation, he found himself grasping for any tool that might help. Quietly, barely moving his lips, Kevin began reciting the prayer of Saint Michael, a Catholic invocation for protection against spiritual wickedness. The effect was not dramatic or instantaneous, but Kevin noticed the hitchhiker shifting uncomfortably in the passenger seat. The entity's false smile faded, replaced by an expression of irritation. "That won't work," it said, but there was uncertainty in its voice now. Kevin continued the prayer, his voice growing stronger and more confident. He repeated it over and over, focusing his mind entirely on the words and their meaning, using them as a shield against the fear that the entity fed upon. The hitchhiker began to look less solid, its form becoming slightly translucent. "Stop that," it demanded, anger creeping into its tone. "You're ruining everything. I chose you. You're mine until the road takes you." But Kevin didn't stop. He cycled through every prayer he could remember from his childhood, every invocation and blessing his grandmother had taught him. The cab of the truck began to feel different, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. Then Kevin saw lights ahead. Not the lights of a town or another vehicle, but something else. A small roadside chapel, one of the makeshift shrines that occasionally appeared along Nevada highways, usually marking spots where fatal accidents had occurred. This one was more elaborate than most, with a proper structure rather than just a cross and flowers. Without fully understanding why, Kevin felt compelled to pull over at this spot. He guided his truck onto the shoulder directly in front of the chapel, a small white building with a peaked roof and a simple wooden cross mounted above the door. As soon as Kevin's truck came to a complete stop, the hitchhiker let out a sound that wasn't quite human, a mixture of rage and fear. The entity's form was flickering now, becoming increasingly unstable. "You can't do this," it hissed. "We had an agreement. You invited me in." "I'm uninviting you," Kevin said with more confidence than he felt. "Get out of my truck. Leave me alone. In the name of God and all that's holy, I command you to leave." The formal language felt strange in his mouth, but it seemed to carry weight. The hitchhiker's form shimmered and distorted, the human mask slipping to reveal something underneath that Kevin's mind refused to process clearly, catching only glimpses of something vast and terrible and utterly wrong. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, the entity was simply gone. The passenger seat was empty, with no sign that anyone had ever been sitting there. Kevin sat gripping his steering wheel, his entire body shaking with released tension and adrenaline. After several minutes, he climbed down from his cab and approached the roadside chapel on unsteady legs. The door was unlocked, opening to reveal a tiny interior with a single bench and a small altar holding a Bible and various religious icons. Kevin sat on the bench and wept, releasing the terror and stress of the past hours. When he finally composed himself enough to think clearly, he examined the chapel more carefully. A plaque on the wall indicated that it had been built in memory of several truck drivers who had died in accidents along this stretch of highway over the years. Their names were listed, along with dates ranging from the 1950s to the early 2000s. Kevin wondered how many of them had picked up the hitchhiker, how many had not been as fortunate as he'd been. Kevin spent 30 minutes in that chapel, offering prayers of gratitude for his survival and prayers for the souls of those drivers who hadn't escaped the entity that hunted this highway. When he finally returned to his truck and resumed his journey, the cab felt clean and normal again, free of the oppressive presence that had occupied it. Kevin completed his delivery to Boise without further incident, though he drove the entire remaining distance without stopping except when absolutely necessary. In the years since that night, Kevin has never picked up another hitchhiker, no matter how desperate they appear or how remote the location. He keeps religious symbols in his truck now, a small cross hanging from his rearview mirror and a prayer card tucked into his sun visor. Other drivers have occasionally mocked him for this, calling him superstitious or overly religious, but Kevin doesn't care. He knows what rides the highways at night, waiting for compassionate drivers who make the mistake of stopping. He knows that some passengers can never be fully removed once invited in, that they leave marks on your soul that never quite fade. Kevin still drives that stretch of Highway 93 through Nevada occasionally when his routes require it. But he always stops at the roadside chapel to offer a prayer and to remind himself of the night he barely escaped. Sometimes, late at night when driving through that area, Kevin sees figures standing on the shoulder with their thumbs extended, desperate expressions on their faces. He never slows down. He's learned that compassion must be tempered with wisdom, that not every person who appears to need help is actually human, and that some rides, once begun, can only end in tragedy. The road has its predators, its hunters that wear human faces and exploit human kindness. Kevin survived his encounter, but he carries the knowledge that he was incredibly fortunate, that a combination of childhood faith and a timely roadside shrine saved him from becoming another name on a memorial plaque. And he knows that the hitchhiker is still out there, still standing on dark highways, still waiting for the next compassionate driver who will make the fatal mistake of stopping to help. Story 2. The Load That Changed. Margaret Sullivan had been driving trucks for 7 years, having entered the profession at age 43 after her divorce and a career change from office management. At 50 years old, she was proud of her success in an industry that remained predominantly male and often unwelcoming to older women. Margaret specialized in refrigerated freight, hauling temperature-sensitive cargo like produce, dairy products, and frozen foods across the country. The work required additional certifications and careful attention to temperature controls, but it paid better than standard freight and gave Margaret a sense of professional accomplishment. On a humid July night in 2022, Margaret picked up a load at a distribution center outside of Atlanta, Georgia. The paperwork indicated she was hauling frozen meat products destined for a supermarket chain distribution center in Louisville, Kentucky. The load was substantial, over 40,000 pounds of various frozen beef and pork products packed in cardboard boxes on wooden pallets. Margaret had hauled similar loads dozens of times before and knew the routine well. Keep the refrigeration unit set at -10 degrees Fahrenheit, minimize time with the trailer doors open, and perform regular temperature checks to ensure nothing was thawing during transport. The loading process at the Atlanta warehouse proceeded normally. Forklift operators loaded the pallets into Margaret's trailer while she observed and verified the cargo against her bill of lading. Everything matched the documentation: 217 boxes of frozen meat products, properly labeled and secured. Margaret set her refrigeration unit to the required temperature, sealed the trailer doors, and conducted her pre-trip inspection before departing the facility around 10 p.m. The route to Louisville was straightforward, primarily following Interstate 75 north through Georgia and Tennessee, a drive Margaret had made many times. She estimated 7 to 8 hours of driving time with one scheduled fuel stop, putting her at the Louisville distribution center by early morning. The summer weather was warm and humid, typical for July in the South, but that wouldn't affect her refrigerated cargo as long as the cooling unit continued functioning properly. Margaret made good time through the first few hours of the drive, passing through Chattanooga and into Tennessee without incident. Around 1:30 in the morning, she pulled into a large truck stop near Knoxville for her planned fuel stop and a brief rest break. This was also an opportunity to perform a routine check of her refrigeration unit and verify that the cargo temperature was being maintained correctly. The trailer's external temperature display showed -9 degrees Fahrenheit, well within acceptable range. After refueling and using the restroom, Margaret walked around her trailer performing a visual inspection. Everything appeared normal. The refrigeration unit was running smoothly without unusual sounds or vibrations. The trailer doors were properly sealed, and no warning lights indicated any mechanical issues. Satisfied that her cargo was secure and properly cooled, Margaret climbed back into her cab and resumed her journey northward. About 45 minutes after leaving the truck stop, Margaret became aware of an unusual smell. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, a vaguely organic odor that seemed to be coming from the trailer behind her. This was concerning because properly frozen and sealed cargo shouldn't produce any smell detectable in the cab. Margaret checked her refrigeration unit display, which still showed the temperature at -9 degrees. Everything indicated the system was functioning normally, yet the smell was undeniable and growing stronger. Margaret pulled onto the shoulder of the interstate and climbed down to investigate. Walking to the back of her trailer, she placed her hand on the exterior metal surface. It felt cold, exactly as it should. The refrigeration unit was running normally, its compressor cycling on and off in the expected pattern. But the smell was stronger back here, a distinctly unpleasant odor that Margaret was beginning to identify as decay, the smell of rotting meat. This made no sense. Her cargo had been frozen solid when loaded just a few hours earlier, and the refrigeration system showed no signs of malfunction. Even if the unit had completely failed, which it clearly hadn't, the cargo would take many hours to thaw enough to start producing odors. Margaret considered opening the trailer doors to inspect the cargo directly, but hesitated. Opening a refrigerated trailer on the side of the highway would allow warm, humid air to flood into the cargo area, potentially compromising the entire load if there wasn't actually a problem. Margaret decided to continue to the next truck stop. where she could open the trailer in a more controlled environment and investigate properly. She climbed back into her cab and pulled back onto the interstate, breathing through her mouth to minimize the increasingly powerful smell that was somehow penetrating into the cab, despite all the seals and barriers between the trailer and the driver compartment. 15 minutes later, the smell had become overwhelming, a nauseating stench of advanced decomposition that made Margaret's eyes water and her stomach lurch. She couldn't understand how this was possible. Nothing in her experience explained how frozen meat could go bad so quickly, or how the smell could be so powerful when the refrigeration system showed everything was functioning normally. Margaret activated her hazard lights and pulled over again, this time determined to open the trailer and see what was happening regardless of company policy about opening refrigerated trailers in uncontrolled environments. Margaret walked to the rear of her trailer and broke the seal on the doors, the metal strap that indicated the trailer hadn't been opened since the warehouse. The smell that poured out when she opened the doors was indescribable, so powerful and nauseating that Margaret stumbled backward and vomited onto the pavement. When she recovered enough to look into the trailer, Margaret's flashlight beam revealed a scene of impossible horror. The cargo had changed. Instead of the neat stacks of boxed frozen meat products she'd loaded in Atlanta, the trailer now contained dozens of black plastic body bags, the kind used by coroners and morgues to transport human remains. The bags were arranged on the same wooden pallets but were clearly not the cargo Margaret had been given. Worse, many of the bags had split open or were poorly sealed, revealing decomposing human bodies in various states of decay. Margaret screamed and ran from the trailer, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. She grabbed her cell phone with shaking hands and dialed 911, stammering out her location and begging for police to come immediately. The dispatcher struggled to understand Margaret's panicked and incoherent explanation, asking her to calm down and describe the situation clearly. Margaret tried to explain that her cargo had somehow been replaced with dead bodies, that she was hauling human remains instead of frozen meat, that something impossible had happened. While Margaret was on the phone with the dispatcher, still standing a good 30 feet from her trailer, she heard sounds coming from inside the cargo area, not the mechanical sounds of the refrigeration unit, but organic sounds, movement, the rustling of plastic. And then, impossibly, voices. Low moaning and whispering sounds that definitely came from inside the trailer, from the body bags that shouldn't contain anything capable of making noise. Margaret dropped her phone and ran toward the front of her truck, intending to lock herself in the cab until police arrived. But as she ran past the length of her trailer, she could see through the open rear doors that figures were moving inside. The body bags were shifting and bulging as whatever was inside them began to move. Zippers were sliding open from the inside, and pale hands were emerging from the openings. Margaret reached her cab and hauled herself inside, locking the doors and watching in her mirrors as figures began climbing out of her trailer. They moved stiffly and awkwardly, clearly not alive in any conventional sense, but animated by something that Margaret's rational mind refused to accept. There were dozens of them, men and women of various ages, all showing signs of death and decay, all moving with terrible purpose toward the front of the truck. The figures surrounded Margaret's cab, pressing their gray faces against the windows and doors, leaving smears of fluids on the glass. Their eyes were clouded with death, but they seemed to see Margaret clearly, focusing on her with what appeared to be rage or hunger or some emotion that the dead shouldn't be capable of feeling. They began pounding on the truck, their fists hitting the metal with rhythmic thuds. Margaret curled up in her seat, screaming, her mind fragmenting under the impossible horror of what was happening. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The pounding ceased, the figures vanished, and Margaret was alone on the dark highway shoulder. She remained curled in her seat for long minutes, too terrified to move or look outside. Finally, she heard sirens approaching and red and blue lights flashed in her mirrors. Police had arrived in response to her 911 call. Margaret climbed down from her cab on shaking legs as two state troopers approached her, asking if she was all right and what the emergency was. Margaret tried to explain about the bodies and the figures, but she could see the skepticism in the officers' expressions. One trooper walked to the rear of Margaret's trailer, which still had its doors standing open from when Margaret had inspected the cargo. He shone his flashlight inside and called back to his partner. "Ma'am, your cargo appears to be frozen meat products in boxes, just like your paperwork indicates. There's nothing unusual here." The trooper's words made no sense to Margaret. She'd seen the body bags, seen the corpses climbing out of them. But when the officers insisted she come look at her trailer, Margaret saw that they were right. The cargo area contained exactly what she'd loaded in Atlanta. Neat stacks of boxed frozen meat on wooden pallets, everything properly arranged and frozen solid. The troopers clearly believed Margaret was having some kind of mental health crisis or was under the influence of drugs. They made her perform field sobriety tests, which she passed, then strongly suggested she park at the next truck stop and get some rest rather than continuing to drive. They implied that if they received another call about her, they'd have to pursue more serious interventions. Margaret numbly agreed, thanking them and apologizing for the false alarm. After the police departed, Margaret sat in her truck for over an hour, trying to understand what had happened. Had she hallucinated the entire experience? Was she suffering from some kind of breakdown brought on by stress and fatigue? The smell of decay was completely gone now, replaced by the normal odors of the highway in her truck. Her phone showed the 911 call in her recent call history, proving that much had been real. But the cargo that had so horrifically transformed was now exactly what it should have been all along. Margaret eventually continued her journey, delivering the load to Louisville on schedule. The receiving warehouse reported no problems with the cargo. Everything was properly frozen, correctly labeled, and in good condition. Margaret's refrigeration unit logs showed the temperature had never varied from the required range throughout the entire journey. By every objective measure, nothing unusual had occurred during this routine freight haul. But Margaret knows what she saw and experienced, the smell of decay that filled her cab, the body bags that replaced her legitimate cargo, the figures that climbed out and surrounded her truck. These things were real in some way that transcended normal reality. Margaret has researched the route she drove that night, looking for any explanation. She discovered that Interstate 75 through Tennessee follows a path that was used during the Civil War to transport casualties from various battles. Thousands of dead soldiers were moved along these routes, their bodies taken to temporary morgues and burial sites. Margaret also learned that the warehouse where she'd picked up the load in Atlanta had been built on the site of a former funeral home that had been shut down in the 1970s following allegations of improper handling of remains. Local news archives contained stories about bodies being stored in inadequate conditions and rumors of remains being disposed of illegally to cover up the funeral home's negligence. These historical facts provided Margaret with a framework for understanding her experience, though not a true explanation. Perhaps her truck had somehow intersected with spiritual echoes of those long-dead bodies, had briefly become a vehicle for the restless dead to make their presence known. Or perhaps the trauma stored in the land itself. The memory of death and improper treatment of human remains had manifested in her trailer that night, choosing her as an unwitting witness to historical horrors. Margaret continued driving for several more months after that night, but her heart was no longer in the work. Every refrigerated load carried the fear that it might transform again, that she might open her trailer to find it filled with death instead of legitimate cargo. The rational part of her mind knew this was unlikely, that what had happened was a one-time paranormal event that probably wouldn't repeat. But fear isn't rational, and trauma doesn't respond to logical arguments. Eventually, Margaret left the trucking industry entirely, taking a job managing a small warehouse in her hometown where she never had to drive long distances or haul refrigerated cargo. She still has nightmares about that night, dreams where she opens trailer doors to find horrors instead of freight, where the dead climb out and surround her with their clouded eyes and reaching hands. She's learned that some cargo carries more than physical weight, that the vehicles we drive might sometimes transport things that have nothing to do with the bills of lading or manifest documents. Margaret rarely talks about her experience, knowing that most people would dismiss it as a hallucination or mental breakdown. But she's connected with online communities of truck drivers who share paranormal experiences, and she's discovered that other drivers have reported similar events along that stretch of Interstate 75. Stories of loads that transform, of cargo that becomes something impossible, of trailers that contain death instead of commercial freight. These accounts provide Margaret with some comfort, knowing she's not alone in what she experienced, knowing that the roads carry more than just trucks and cars. They carry memories and trauma and spirits that sometimes reach across the barrier between worlds to touch the living. To remind us that death is never as final or as contained as we'd like to believe. The highway remains, and whatever haunts it continues to ride with unsuspecting drivers, turning routine freight hauls into journeys through nightmare, transforming ordinary cargo into vehicles for the dead to travel one more time along the roads they once knew in life. Story 3. The rest area with no exit. Christopher Dane had been a professional truck driver for 19 years, having started in the industry straight out of high school at age 18. Now 37, he'd accumulated over 2 million miles of safe driving and had earned numerous awards and commendations from the various companies he'd worked for throughout his career. Christopher currently drove for a major freight carrier based in Ohio, handling general merchandise on routes that took him throughout the eastern half of the United States. He was known among his peers as steady and dependable, someone who maintained his equipment properly, followed regulations meticulously, and never took unnecessary risks. On a cold February night in 2021, Christopher was driving southbound on Interstate 77 through West Virginia, hauling a mixed load of consumer goods destined for Charlotte, North Carolina. The route was familiar to Christopher, as he'd driven it at least twice a month for the past several years. The weather was challenging, with light snow falling and temperatures hovering around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, but nothing Christopher couldn't handle with proper caution and reduced speed. Traffic was extremely light due to the late hour and weather conditions, with Christopher seeing perhaps 1 or 2 vehicles every 10 minutes. Around 2:30 in the morning, Christopher began feeling the fatigue that came from hours of night driving in hypnotic snow. His eyes were growing heavy despite the coffee he'd been drinking, and he recognized the early warning signs that he needed to take a break before his drowsiness became dangerous. According to his GPS, there was a rest area coming up in approximately 5 miles, a standard highway rest stop where he could park for 30 minutes, walk around to restore his alertness, and perhaps grab a quick nap if necessary. The sign appeared in his headlights right on schedule. Rest area 1 mile, all vehicles welcome. Christopher activated his turn signal and began moving to the right lane, preparing for the exit ramp. The rest area was set back from the interstate, accessed by a short connector road that curved through a stand of bare trees. As Christopher's truck descended the ramp and followed the access road, he noted that the facility appeared well maintained, with adequate lighting and clearly marked parking areas for both cars and commercial trucks. The rest area consisted of a single-story brick building housing restrooms and vending machines, surrounded by a large parking lot divided into sections for different vehicle types. Several cars were parked in the automobile section, and Christopher could see two other semi-trucks in the commercial vehicle parking area at the far end of the lot. The presence of other vehicles was reassuring, indicating this was a legitimate and reasonably safe place to stop for a rest break. Christopher pulled into an empty truck parking space, applied his air brakes, and shut down his engine. The sudden silence after hours of engine noise and road sounds was profound. Christopher sat for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the relative darkness now that his headlights were off. The parking lot was illuminated by tall sodium vapor lamps that cast everything in an orange-yellow glow, and light snow continued to fall in gentle swirls. Everything appeared normal and peaceful, exactly what Christopher expected from a typical rest area stop. Christopher climbed down from his cab, immediately feeling the bite of the cold February air. He stretched his back and legs, working out the stiffness that came from sitting for extended periods, then walked toward the brick building to use the restroom. As he walked, Christopher noticed that the other trucks in the parking lot appeared to be unoccupied, with no lights visible in their cabs and no signs of drivers moving around them. This wasn't unusual, as drivers often took sleep breaks in their sleeper berths. But something about the stillness of the vehicles struck Christopher as odd. The building's entrance was a set of glass doors with metal frames, lit from within by fluorescent lights. Christopher pushed through the doors into a small lobby area with hallways leading to separate men's and women's restrooms. A bank of vending machines lined one wall, their displays brightly advertising various snacks and beverages. Everything looked clean and well-maintained, though Christopher noticed that the vending machines had an older design, the kind that had been common maybe 10 or 15 years earlier rather than the modern touchscreen models most rest areas had upgraded to. Christopher used the restroom, which was remarkably clean for a highway rest stop, then stopped at the vending machines to purchase a candy bar and another coffee. He fed bills into the machine's acceptor, which took them on the first try, a minor miracle in Christopher's experience with vending machines. As he waited for the machine to dispense his selections, Christopher noticed that the building was absolutely silent except for the hum of the vending machines. No sounds of other people, no footsteps or voices or running water from the restrooms, just oppressive silence. This silence struck Christopher as increasingly wrong. He'd seen at least 4 or 5 cars in the parking lot when he arrived, plus the 2 other trucks. Even accounting for people sleeping in their vehicles, there should be at least 1 or 2 other people using the facilities at any given time. But the building felt completely empty apart from Christopher himself. He grabbed his purchases from the vending machine and walked quickly back toward the exit, his unease growing with each step. As Christopher pushed through the glass doors back into the parking lot, he stopped abruptly. Something had changed. The vehicles that had been parked around the lot when he entered the building were different now. The cars were older models, vehicles from the 1980s and 90s rather than recent years. The 2 trucks that had been in the commercial parking area were also different, replaced by older models with styling that hadn't been current for decades. And there were more vehicles now. Dozens more filling the parking lot far beyond its capacity, with trucks and cars parked at odd angles and crowded together in ways that blocked normal traffic flow. Christopher felt his heart rate spike as he tried to process what he was seeing. Had he been inside the building longer than he thought? Had there been some kind of event that drew numerous vehicles to this rest area while he was in the restroom? But that didn't explain the change in vehicle types or the impossible number of vehicles now crammed into a parking lot that had been less than half full minutes earlier. Christopher walked quickly toward where his truck should have been parked. As he got closer, he saw that his truck was still there, but it looked wrong. The paint had faded, rust had appeared around the wheel wells and lower panels, and the tires looked worn and weathered. His truck had aged decades in the minutes he'd been away from it. Christopher broke into a run, reaching his cab and climbing up to look inside. The interior showed the same advanced aging, with the seat fabric cracked and torn, the dashboard faded and brittle, dust covering every surface. Christopher tried his door handle, expecting it to be locked, but the door opened easily. He climbed into the cab and tried the ignition, but nothing happened when he turned the key. No lights on the dashboard, no sound from the starter. Completely dead. The truck's batteries had been drained or had failed completely. Christopher's hands shook as he grabbed his cell phone from the cup holder where he'd left it. The phone's screen was cracked, and when he tried to power it on, nothing happened. The device was as dead as his truck. Fighting down panic, Christopher climbed back down and looked around the parking lot. The other vehicles remained still and silent, with no signs of occupants or movement. In the distance, Christopher could still see the brick building, its lights still burning, looking exactly as it had when he'd entered minutes earlier. But the access road leading back to the interstate was no longer visible. Where the exit should have been, there was only darkness, a wall of absolute blackness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Christopher started walking toward where he remembered the exit being located, his boots crunching in the thin layer of snow that continued to fall. As he got closer to the darkness, Christopher felt a deep wrongness emanating from it, a sense that crossing that threshold would be profoundly dangerous. He stopped about 10 feet from the darkness and stared into it, trying to see any hint of the access road or the interstate beyond. There was nothing, just absolute darkness that hurt to look at, as if it were a hole in reality itself. A sound behind Christopher made him spin around. A figure was standing near one of the parked cars, a man who appeared to be in his 60s or 70s, wearing clothes that looked decades out of date. The man was watching Christopher with an expression of profound sadness. "You can't leave that way," the man said, his voice carrying clearly across the parking lot despite the distance between them. "None of us can. The exit doesn't work. It hasn't worked for longer than I can remember." Christopher approached the man cautiously, questions tumbling out. Who was he? How long had he been here? What had happened to this place? The man's answers were disturbing and fragmentary. He claimed to have stopped at this rest area in 1983, intending to rest for 30 minutes during a drive from Pittsburgh to Roanoke. He'd entered the building to use the restroom, and when he came out, everything had changed, just as Christopher had experienced. The man had been trapped here ever since, nearly 40 years by his estimation, though he admitted that time moved strangely in this place and he might have lost track. The man introduced himself as Robert and explained that other people were trapped here as well, though most of them stayed in their vehicles or in the building, having given up on finding escape years or decades earlier. Some people had tried walking into the darkness where the exit should be, and they never came back. Others had tried destroying the building or their vehicles, thinking that might somehow break the spell or curse or whatever held this place. Nothing worked. The rest area existed outside of normal time and space, a pocket of reality that captured travelers and held them indefinitely. Christopher refused to accept this explanation. There had to be a way out, some exit or portal or weakness in whatever barrier surrounded this place. He spent hours walking the perimeter of the parking lot, searching for any passage back to the normal world. Everywhere he went, he found only that wall of absolute darkness, impenetrable and threatening. As Christopher walked, he encountered other trapped people, men and women of various ages, all wearing clothes from different eras, all telling similar stories of stopping for a brief rest and finding themselves unable to leave. Some of the trapped people had been here for months, others for years, a few claiming decades. They survived somehow, though none of them could explain how. They didn't seem to age or need food or water in any normal sense, though they could still eat and drink from the vending machines in the building, which somehow never ran empty despite no service trucks ever arriving to refill them. Time was fluid and unreliable, with some people reporting that days passed in what felt like hours, while others experienced the opposite effect. Christopher tried his truck repeatedly, hoping it might start and allow him to simply drive out of this place, darkness barrier or not. But the vehicle remained dead, unresponsive to any of his efforts to revive it. He considered abandoning his truck and trying to take one of the other vehicles, but all of them were similarly non-functional, their engines dead and batteries drained by the strange physics of this trapped space. As what Christopher estimated to be several days passed, though he had no reliable way to measure time, he felt despair beginning to overtake him. He would never complete his delivery to Charlotte, never see his family again, never drive the highways he knew so well. He would spend the rest of his existence, however long that might be, trapped in this impossible rest area with dozens of other forgotten travelers who'd made the fatal mistake of stopping here. Then Christopher noticed something. The building's clock, visible through the glass doors, showed the time as 2:47 a.m. Every time Christopher looked at it, regardless of how much time seemed to have passed, the clock showed the same time. This suggested that the entire rest area existed in a single frozen moment, a bubble of time that never progressed. If that was true, then perhaps the key to escape was finding a way to break that temporal lock, to force time to move forward again. Christopher shared his theory with Robert and some of the other trapped travelers. Most of them were skeptical, having tried numerous escape theories over their years of captivity, but a few were willing to help Christopher experiment. Together, they attempted various actions designed to force change in the frozen environment. They tried smashing the clock, tried destroying the building's lights, tried pushing vehicles out of their parking spaces to alter the physical arrangement of the lot. Nothing worked until Christopher tried something desperate. He walked to the absolute edge of the darkness where the exit should be, and despite every instinct screaming at him not to, he reached out and placed his hand into the void. The sensation was indescribable, like plunging his hand into water that was simultaneously freezing and burning, solid and liquid. Christopher felt the darkness pulling at him, trying to draw him in completely, and he had to fight with all his strength to pull his hand back. But when he withdrew his hand, something had changed. His watch, which had been frozen at the same time since he arrived, had jumped forward by 3 minutes. Christopher had forced time to move, if only slightly. He realized that the darkness wasn't a barrier but a threshold, something that needed to be crossed, but at tremendous cost. Crossing it completely, as other trapped travelers had attempted, apparently led to oblivion or death or something worse. But interacting with it briefly, maintaining one's connection to the rest area while touching the void, created a contradiction that forced the frozen time to progress. Christopher explained his discovery to the others and proposed a desperate plan. If they all touched the darkness simultaneously, maintaining their positions while forcing the temporal contradiction, they might generate enough forward time movement to break the rest area free from its frozen state. Many of the trapped travelers refused, too terrified of the darkness to approach it after years of avoiding it. But about a dozen people, including Robert, agreed to try Christopher's plan. They positioned themselves around the perimeter of the parking lot, each person standing before the darkness at different points. At Christopher's signal, they all reached out and plunged their hands into the void. The sensation was agonizing, and Christopher heard screams from some of the others as they experienced the terrible wrongness of the darkness. Christopher forced himself to maintain his position, keeping his hands submerged in the void while watching his truck in the distance. The truck began to change, its appearance shifting and flickering. The advanced aging reversed, the rust and weathering disappearing, the vehicle returning to its normal condition. Throughout the parking lot, all the vehicles were transforming, updating to their proper appearances. The darkness itself began to recede, pulling back like a curtain being drawn away, revealing the access road and beyond it, the lights of the interstate. Christopher pulled his hand from the darkness and ran toward his truck, shouting for the others to do the same. He climbed into his cab and turned the key, praying the engine would start. It caught on the first try, roaring to life with beautiful normality. Christopher put the truck in gear and began driving toward the exit, watching in his mirrors as other vehicles started and followed him. The darkness was collapsing behind them, the rest area folding in on itself as the temporal freeze broke down completely. Christopher's truck emerged onto the access road and climbed back toward the interstate. He didn't stop or slow down, merging onto the highway and accelerating to cruising speed, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the rest area. In his mirrors, Christopher could see other vehicles emerging as well, cars and trucks from multiple eras all returning to the normal world together. Some immediately pulled over, their drivers too overwhelmed to continue. Others kept driving, perhaps afraid that stopping for any reason might trap them again. Christopher drove straight to Charlotte, completing his delivery despite being several days late according to his company's tracking systems. His dispatch was furious about the delay and his failure to check in, and Christopher had no explanation he could offer that wouldn't sound insane. He was written up for the violation and nearly terminated, saved only by his 19 years of perfect record prior to this incident. Christopher later tried to find the rest area again, searching maps and driving that stretch of Interstate 77 multiple times. There's no rest area where he remembered stopping that night. The State Transportation Department has no records of a facility at that location, and other drivers Christopher questioned claimed there had never been a rest area there. But Christopher knows what happened to him and where he was trapped. He knows that he's not the only driver who stopped at that impossible place and had to fight their way free. Christopher received a letter several months after his experience, mailed from an address in Pennsylvania. It was from Robert, the older man who'd been trapped since 1983. Robert wrote that he'd made it home, had been reunited with family members who'd long since given up hope of ever seeing him again. He thanked Christopher for refusing to accept the rest area's trap, for finding the solution that freed everyone who'd been willing to take the risk. Robert's letter included a warning. There are other places like the rest area throughout the highway system, traps that exist outside of normal time and space, waiting for unsuspecting travelers to stop and become trapped. Christopher still drives trucks, still makes the runs that support his livelihood and feed his family. But he's far more careful now about where he stops for rest breaks. He researches facilities ahead of time, confirms they exist on official maps and in other drivers' reports, never stopping at any location that feels wrong or unfamiliar. Because Christopher understands that the highway system is more than just asphalt and bridges and painted lines. There are gaps in the network, places where reality grows thin and travelers can slip through into spaces that don't obey normal physical laws. Some people who disappear on the highways aren't lost to accidents or crimes, but to these temporal traps, rest areas and truck stops and way stations that capture the unwary and hold them outside of time. Christopher was fortunate enough to escape and to free others in the process. But he knows that countless people remain trapped in similar places, spending what might be eternity in parking lots and rest facilities that exist in frozen moments, waiting for someone clever or desperate or lucky enough to find the key that will set them free. Story 4. The delivery that never happened. Jennifer Wu had been a commercial truck driver for just over 3 years, having entered the profession at age 28 after working various retail and service jobs that left her unfulfilled and barely making ends meet. The structured training program she'd completed and her subsequent employment with a regional carrier had given Jennifer financial stability and independence she'd never experienced before. At 31, she was proud of her accomplishments in the trucking industry and was working toward becoming an owner-operator within the next few years. On a pleasant spring evening in late April of 2023, Jennifer picked up a load at a warehouse facility on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona. The cargo was unusual for Jennifer's typical assignments, consisting of antique furniture and estate sale items being transported to a private collector in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The customer had specifically requested careful handling and climate-controlled transport, so Jennifer was using a temperature-regulated trailer rather than her usual dry van. The load was relatively light in terms of weight, maybe 15,000 pounds total. But the individual pieces were valuable and fragile, requiring extra care during transport and especially during loading and unloading. The loading process took nearly 3 hours as warehouse workers carefully secured each piece of furniture with padding and straps to prevent any shifting or damage during transport. Jennifer supervised closely, verifying that everything was being handled appropriately and that each item matched the detailed inventory list provided by the shipper. The furniture was genuinely beautiful, antique pieces from various periods including Victorian-era chairs, an ornate dining table that looked to be from the early 19th century, several carved wooden cabinets, and an absolutely massive grandfather clock that required 4 people to load safely. The grandfather clock was particularly striking, standing at least 8 feet tall with an elaborately carved wooden case featuring intricate scrollwork and what appeared to be various symbols or runes that Jennifer didn't recognize. The clock's face was made of aged brass with Roman numerals marking the hours, and the pendulum visible through a glass panel in the case was a heavy brass disc engraved with more of those strange symbols. The warehouse supervisor mentioned that the clock was supposedly from the 1700s and had been imported from somewhere in Central Europe, though he didn't know the specific country of origin. Once loading was complete and Jennifer had secured the trailer and set the climate control to maintain a steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit, she began her journey toward Santa Fe. The route was straightforward, taking her northeast from Phoenix through Arizona and into New Mexico, primarily following Interstate 40. Jennifer estimated about 7 hours of driving time, putting her in Santa Fe around 3 or 4 in the morning. The delivery appointment wasn't until 10 a.m., giving her plenty of time to arrive early, park somewhere safe, and get a few hours of rest before the unloading process began. The drive through Arizona proceeded normally. Jennifer made a fuel stop near Flagstaff around 9 p.m., using the break to grab dinner and perform a routine inspection of her trailer and cargo. Everything was secure and properly maintained. The climate control system was functioning perfectly, keeping the trailer at the desired temperature. Jennifer chatted briefly with another driver at the fuel island, a friendly older man who was hauling produce to Albuquerque, before resuming her journey eastward. Around 11 p.m., as Jennifer crossed the Arizona-New Mexico border and entered into the high desert landscape of western New Mexico, she began hearing sounds from her trailer. At first, they were barely noticeable, just occasional creaks and settling noises that could be attributed to the cargo shifting slightly despite being strapped down. But as Jennifer continued driving, the sounds became more frequent and more distinct. They sounded like footsteps, like someone walking around inside the trailer, moving from one end to the other. This was impossible, of course. Jennifer had personally secured the trailer doors after loading was complete, and she'd verified they remained sealed during her fuel stop. No one could be inside the trailer, and even if someone had somehow hidden among the furniture, Jennifer would have noticed during the loading process or heard them much earlier in the journey. Yet the footstep sounds continued, regular and rhythmic, unmistakably suggesting a person walking through the cargo area. Jennifer turned down her radio to listen more carefully. The sounds were definitely coming from the trailer, transmitted through the metal floor and frame directly into her cab. Step, 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 pause, then more steps moving in a different direction. Occasionally, Jennifer heard other sounds mixed with the footsteps. Creaking wood, the rustle of fabric or padding, and once, what sounded distinctly like furniture being moved or dragged across the trailer floor. Jennifer pulled onto the shoulder of the interstate and brought her truck to a stop. She sat for a moment listening, and the sounds from the trailer immediately ceased. Perfect silence. Jennifer grabbed her flashlight and climbed down from her cab, walking the length of her trailer to the rear doors. The seal was intact, showing no signs of tampering. Jennifer pressed her ear against the trailer's metal skin and listened intently. Nothing. No sounds at all, just the normal background noise of the desert night and occasional vehicles passing on the interstate. Feeling foolish but still uneasy, Jennifer climbed back into her cab and resumed driving. Within minutes, the sound started again. Footsteps, definitely footsteps, walking from the front of the trailer toward the rear. Jennifer tried to rationalize what she was hearing. Perhaps the temperature changes as night fell were causing the wooden furniture to expand or contract, producing sounds that her mind was interpreting as footsteps. Or maybe the straps securing the cargo were settling and shifting in ways that created rhythmic noises. These explanations didn't entirely satisfy Jennifer, but they were preferable to considering paranormal alternatives. Then Jennifer heard something new. A loud, resonant chiming sound like a grandfather clock striking the hour. It came from the trailer, unmistakably the sound of the large antique clock she'd loaded in Phoenix. The chimes rang out 12 times, indicating midnight, though Jennifer's dashboard clock showed the time was actually 11:37 p.m. The chiming continued for nearly a full minute, each tone deep and reverberating, clearly audible even over the road noise and her truck's engine. Jennifer felt her heart racing. The clock couldn't be running. It hadn't been wound or activated, and the movement of the truck should prevent any pendulum from swinging properly even if it had been started. Yet the chiming was undeniable, clear and loud and definitely coming from her trailer. As the last chime faded away, the footstep sounds resumed, but now they seemed more purposeful, more urgent, as if whoever or whatever was walking in the trailer was searching for something or trying to accomplish some task. Jennifer considered calling her dispatcher to report the situation. But what would she say? That her cargo of antique furniture was walking around and the grandfather clock was chiming on its own? They'd think she was having some kind of breakdown or was under the influence of drugs. Jennifer decided to continue to Santa Fe and deliver the load as scheduled. She'd inform the customer about the unusual sounds and let them investigate. Perhaps they'd have some explanation for what was happening. The sounds from the trailer continued for the next 2 hours as Jennifer drove through the darkness of New Mexico. The footsteps, the creaking of furniture, and occasional chiming from the clock created an eerie symphony that frayed Jennifer's nerves with each passing mile. She tried playing her radio loudly to drown out the sounds, but they cut through the music with disturbing clarity. She tried reasoning with herself, insisting that she was experiencing some form of auditory hallucination brought on by fatigue and the monotony of night driving. But the sounds were too real, too consistent to dismiss. Around 1:30 in the morning, Jennifer saw lights ahead that resolved into a rest area. She desperately needed a break from the psychological pressure of the sounds in her trailer. So she pulled off the interstate and into the rest area parking lot. As soon as her truck came to a complete stop and she shut down the engine, the sounds from the trailer ceased immediately. Jennifer sat in the sudden silence, trying to calm her racing heart and settle her jangled nerves. After several minutes, Jennifer climbed down and walked to a picnic table some distance from her truck, wanting to put physical space between herself and the trailer. She sat at the table and called her brother in California, someone she trusted and could talk to about strange experiences. She explained what was happening, describing the sounds and her growing fear that she was hauling something more than just antique furniture. Her brother listened without interrupting, then offered his thoughts. He suggested that antique objects, especially items that had been in families for generations, or that had witnessed significant historical events, sometimes carried emotional or spiritual residue. The furniture Jennifer was transporting might have absorbed energies from its previous owners or the places it had been housed. Her brother, who was interested in paranormal topics, explained that some researchers believed objects could record and replay events, like a stone tape that preserved impressions of the past. The sounds Jennifer was hearing might be echoes of previous times when the furniture had been used, ghosts of moments replaying themselves. This explanation both comforted and disturbed Jennifer. It provided a framework for understanding what was happening, but it also confirmed that the phenomena was genuinely paranormal rather than mechanical or explainable. Jennifer thanked her brother and ended the call, then sat at the picnic table for another 20 minutes, gathering her courage to continue the journey. Finally, knowing she had to complete the delivery regardless of her fear, Jennifer returned to her truck and resumed driving toward Santa Fe. The moment Jennifer accelerated back onto the interstate, the sounds from the trailer resumed. But now they were different, more aggressive. The footsteps were faster, almost running, and Jennifer heard loud banging as if someone was pounding on the trailer walls from inside. The grandfather clock began chiming erratically, striking random numbers of times without pattern. Other sounds joined the cacophony. Voices low and indistinct, but definitely human voices speaking in what sounded like a foreign language Jennifer didn't recognize. Jennifer pushed her speed higher, desperate to reach Santa Fe and be rid of this cargo as quickly as possible. She no longer cared about safety or regulations or proper rest breaks. She just wanted this nightmare journey to end. The sounds grew louder and more chaotic, creating a din that made it difficult for Jennifer to concentrate on driving. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, counting down the miles to her destination. Then, without warning, everything stopped. The sounds ceased completely and instantly, leaving only normal road noise and the hum of Jennifer's engine. The sudden silence was almost as unnerving as the sounds had been. Jennifer checked her mirrors, half expecting to see something wrong with her trailer, but it looked normal, just rolling along behind her truck as it should. Jennifer didn't trust the silence, suspecting it was temporary, but mile after mile passed without the sounds returning. Jennifer reached the outskirts of Santa Fe around 3:15 a.m. Following the GPS directions to the delivery address, she found herself leaving the main highways and driving through residential areas, then onto smaller roads that led into the hills east of the city. The address she'd been given was increasingly remote, taking her onto narrow dirt roads that wound through piñon pine forests. Jennifer began to worry that she'd entered the wrong address into her GPS or that there'd been an error in the delivery information. Finally, after nearly 30 minutes of driving on progressively worse roads, Jennifer's GPS indicated she'd arrived at her destination. Her headlights illuminated a large house, or perhaps mansion would be more accurate, built in a Spanish colonial style with white stucco walls and a red tile roof. The house was dark, with no exterior lights visible and no signs of activity. Jennifer checked her paperwork again, confirming that this was indeed the correct address, and that her delivery appointment was for 10 a.m., still more than 6 hours away. Jennifer decided to park and wait for a reasonable hour to contact the customer. She pulled her truck into a turnaround area near the house and shut down her engine. In the sudden silence, Jennifer heard something that made her blood run cold, a voice from her trailer, clear and distinct, speaking English this time. "Please," the voice said, sounding desperate and frightened. "Please don't leave us here. This is a terrible place. Don't leave us here with him." Jennifer wanted to run, to simply flee on foot and leave her truck and its haunted cargo behind. But she was miles from the nearest town, alone in the dark in an unfamiliar area. She forced herself to stay in her cab, doors locked, telling herself that dawn was only a few hours away and then she could complete the delivery and be done with this nightmare. She tried to rest, but sleep was impossible with adrenaline flooding her system and every nerve on high alert. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, Jennifer heard footsteps outside her truck. Not the ghostly footsteps from her trailer, but real footsteps crunching on the gravel drive. A figure appeared beside her truck, an elderly man wearing expensive-looking clothes, his white hair neatly trimmed, his expression pleasant and welcoming. He knocked on Jennifer's window, and she reluctantly rolled it down a few inches. "Ms. Wu, I presume," the man said in a cultured accent Jennifer couldn't quite place. "I'm so pleased you've arrived safely with my acquisitions. I know it's quite early, but I'm eager to inspect the pieces. Would you mind if we begin the unloading process now?" Something about the man's smile and the way his eyes watched her made Jennifer profoundly uncomfortable, but she agreed, wanting only to complete the delivery and leave. Jennifer backed her trailer up to a large garage or workshop attached to the house, following the man's directions. When she opened the trailer doors, the interior looked normal, with all the furniture pieces exactly where they'd been secured during loading. No signs of disturbance, no evidence of the impossible sounds and voices Jennifer had experienced during the drive. The man began examining each piece carefully, running his hands over the wood with what seemed like possessive satisfaction. When they reached the grandfather clock, the man's expression changed to something like reverence or hunger. "Ah," he breathed. "The centerpiece of the collection. Do you know what this is, Ms. Wu?" This clock was crafted by a master clockmaker in Prague in 1726. It's said that he imprisoned the souls of his enemies inside the mechanism, binding them to the clock's eternal counting of hours. Every family that's owned this clock has reported strange phenomena. Voices, apparitions, unexplained deaths. It's one of the most genuinely haunted objects in existence, and now it's finally mine. Jennifer felt sick. She'd been transporting not just furniture, but objects with dark histories, things that had brought suffering to their previous owners. And this man had deliberately collected them, was pleased by their cursed nature. Jennifer helped unload the remaining pieces as quickly as possible, wanting nothing more than to get away from this place and this collector of cursed things. When the unloading was complete and Jennifer had obtained the required delivery signature, she walked quickly back to her truck. As she climbed into her cab, she heard that voice again, the desperate plea from before. "You should have destroyed us. You should have burned everything rather than bringing us to him. What he plans is so much worse than what we've already endured." Jennifer started her engine and drove away from the mansion as fast as the narrow roads would safely allow. She emerged back onto paved highways and put miles between herself and that terrible place. When she was safely back in Phoenix, Jennifer submitted her delivery confirmation and immediately requested that she never be assigned any more deliveries for that particular customer. She didn't explain why, just insisted it was non-negotiable. Jennifer later researched the address where she delivered the furniture. The property was owned by a private individual who'd purchased it 15 years earlier and had been buying antique objects from around the world ever since. There were rumors in paranormal investigation communities about this person, stories suggesting he was creating some kind of collection of genuinely cursed or haunted items for purposes nobody understood. Some speculated he was a wealthy eccentric with an unusual hobby, while others suggested darker motivations involving occult practices or attempts to harness supernatural energies. Jennifer tried to put the experience behind her, but she found herself researching the grandfather clock, trying to confirm the story the collector had told her. She discovered references to a clockmaker in Prague who'd been accused of witchcraft in the early 18th century. though details were sparse and possibly unreliable. There were mentions of a clock he'd created that was said to be cursed, that brought misfortune to anyone who possessed it. The clock had disappeared from historical records around the mid-20th century, apparently lost during World War II, though some sources suggested it had been deliberately hidden to prevent it from causing further harm. Now that clock was back in circulation, delivered by Jennifer's unwitting hands to someone who wanted it specifically for its cursed properties. Jennifer wondered about the voices she'd heard, the pleas not to be left with him. Were those truly the souls of people bound to the clock's mechanism as the collector claimed? Were they conscious and suffering, aware of their imprisonment? Jennifer had no way to know, but the thought haunted her. Jennifer continued driving trucks, but she became much more selective about the loads she'd accept. She refused deliveries of estate sale items or antiques, sticking to standard commercial freight that had no history or emotional resonance. She'd learned that some cargo carries more than physical weight, that objects can be contaminated by dark histories and suffering, and that there are people in the world who actively seek out such things for reasons that decent people couldn't comprehend. Sometimes late at night when driving through empty stretches of highway, Jennifer thinks she hears echoes of those footsteps and voices from her trailer. She knows it's probably just memory and imagination, but the sounds remind her that she'd been part of something terrible, that she'd transported suffering and darkness and delivered it to someone who would use it for purposes she didn't want to imagine. The highway had taught Jennifer that evil doesn't always come in dramatic or obvious forms. Sometimes it travels in sealed trailers hidden among antique furniture, waiting to be delivered to addresses in remote locations where no one will hear the voices crying out for release. And sometimes truck drivers, honest people just trying to do their jobs, become unwitting accomplices to that evil, carrying curses and haunted objects to their destinations, and adding their own guilt to the long history of suffering those objects have already accumulated. Story 5. The Road That Loops. Antonio Vasquez had been hauling freight across the southwestern United States for 12 years, establishing himself as one of the most reliable drivers working for Desert Star Transport out of El Paso, Texas. At 45 years old, Antonio had seen nearly every highway and back road across Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, accumulating enough miles and experience that he could navigate most routes without even consulting his GPS. His knowledge of the region's highways was encyclopedic, including which truck stops had the best food, which way stations were most thorough with inspections, and which stretches of road required extra caution due to weather conditions or poor maintenance. On a scorching August afternoon in 2019, Antonio picked up a load of construction materials in El Paso destined for a building site outside of Tucson, Arizona. The cargo consisted of steel beams, concrete forms, and various hardware, bringing Antonio's total weight to just under 78,000 pounds. The route was one Antonio had driven hundreds of times, Interstate 10 heading west through New Mexico and into Arizona, a relatively straightforward journey of approximately 300 miles that should take about 5 hours under normal conditions. Antonio departed El Paso around 2 in the afternoon, planning to arrive in Tucson before 7 p.m., complete the delivery, and potentially pick up a return load that same evening. The August heat was intense, with temperatures hovering around 105 degrees Fahrenheit, but Antonio's truck had excellent air conditioning and he was accustomed to summer driving in the desert. Traffic was moderate heading west, with the usual mix of commercial trucks and passenger vehicles making the run between El Paso and Tucson. The first 90 miles passed exactly as Antonio expected, taking him through the arid landscape of southern New Mexico with the jagged peaks of various mountain ranges visible in the distance. Around 3:45 p.m., Antonio passed through the small town of Deming, New Mexico, his last significant landmark before crossing into Arizona. He'd made this passage countless times before and knew that the next 70 miles to Lordsburg would be mostly empty highway, cutting through particularly barren desert landscape. About 20 miles west of Deming, Antonio noticed something unusual. A highway sign that he'd never seen before despite his hundreds of trips along this route. The sign was weathered and sun-faded, indicating alternate route, exit 1 mile, with an arrow pointing to an upcoming exit ramp. Antonio frowned at the sign, certain it hadn't existed during his last trip through this area just 2 weeks earlier. New Mexico occasionally opened new routes or alternate paths to relieve traffic congestion, but Antonio hadn't heard about any construction or new roads in this region. As Antonio approached the exit, he could see that the ramp led to a 2-lane highway heading northwest into the desert. The pavement looked relatively new, suggesting recent construction. Antonio was curious about this new route and wondered if it might provide a shortcut that would save time on future trips. However, his GPS showed no alternate routes in this area, displaying only the standard Interstate 10 path. Antonio decided to continue on the familiar interstate rather than exploring an unknown route while carrying a time-sensitive load. Antonio continued westward on Interstate 10, putting the mysterious exit behind him. But approximately 15 miles later, he saw the same sign again. Alternate route, exit 1 mile. This was impossible. Antonio was certain he'd already passed this exit, and the interstate didn't loop back on itself in this area. Yet there was the sign, identical to the previous one, indicating an exit to an alternate route. Antonio checked his odometer and his GPS, both confirming he'd traveled the appropriate distance and was where he should be along Interstate 10. Feeling increasingly uneasy, Antonio passed the second exit without taking it, maintaining his course on the interstate. He told himself it must be 2 different exits with similar signage, though he couldn't explain why he'd never noticed either of them before. The desert landscape rolling past his windows looked normal enough. The same scrubland and distant mountains he'd seen 1,000 times. But something felt subtly wrong, as if the proportions were slightly off or the colors weren't quite right. 10 miles later, the sign appeared again. Same weathered appearance, same faded lettering, same indication of an alternate route exit coming up. Antonio felt his heart rate accelerate. This was beyond coincidence or confusion. Something impossible was happening, some kind of loop or repetition that defied rational explanation. Antonio grabbed his CB radio and called out on Channel 19, asking if any other drivers in the area were experiencing anything unusual. Only static answered him, which was odd given the number of trucks typically on this highway. Antonio took the exit this time, deciding that whatever was happening, continuing to drive the interstate wasn't resolving the situation. The exit ramp curved away from Interstate 10, descending gradually toward the 2-lane highway Antonio had seen from the previous exits. As he merged onto the alternate route, Antonio noted his mileage and the time, 4:23 p.m. He'd see where this road led and how long it took to rejoin the main highway. If it proved to be a legitimate shortcut, he'd note it for future reference. If it was a dead end or led nowhere useful, he'd turn around and find a way back to Interstate 10. The 2-lane highway stretched straight ahead through the desert, heading northwest toward a range of low mountains in the distance. The pavement was smooth and well-maintained, with fresh paint marking the center line and edges. No other vehicles were visible in either direction, giving Antonio the eerie sensation of being completely alone on a brand new road in the middle of nowhere. His GPS showed his truck's position, but the road itself wasn't displayed on the map, leaving a blank space where Antonio was actually driving. Antonio drove for 30 minutes on the alternate route, covering approximately 35 miles at his steady pace. The landscape remained consistently barren, with no variation in the scrubland vegetation or the distant mountains that never seemed to get closer despite Antonio driving directly toward them. No signs indicated distances to towns or services, and no intersections or side roads broke up the monotonous straight path. Antonio was beginning to seriously regret taking this exit, realizing he might have wasted an hour on a route that led nowhere. Then Antonio saw something ahead that made his blood run cold, the same exit sign he'd seen on Interstate 10 indicating alternate route, exit 1 mile, with an arrow pointing toward an exit ramp leading away from the road he was currently on. This was impossible. Antonio was on the alternate route. How could there be an exit for an alternate route from the alternate route itself? The logic was circular and nonsensical, like a snake eating its own tail. Antonio's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he approached the exit. He decided not to take it, instead continuing straight on the two-lane highway to see what would happen. But as he passed the exit ramp, Antonio looked in his mirrors and saw something that shouldn't exist: his own truck, driving on the exit ramp, taking the path Antonio had just chosen not to follow. The truck was identical to his own, same color and model, even the same company markings and unit number. Antonio watched in horror as the duplicate truck descended the ramp and merged onto what appeared to be Interstate 10, driving away in the opposite direction. Antonio pulled over onto the shoulder, his entire body shaking. He sat with his engine idling, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. A duplicate of his truck, or perhaps a ghost of himself making a different choice, or something even stranger that Antonio's mind couldn't categorize. After several minutes of deep breathing and failed attempts to calm himself, Antonio put his truck back in gear and continued forward on the two-lane highway, having no idea what else to do. The pattern repeated. Every 10 to 15 miles, Antonio encountered the same sign indicating an alternate route exit. Sometimes he took the exit, sometimes he didn't. But the results were always disorienting. Taking an exit would lead him to another road that looked identical to the one he'd left, while refusing an exit would result in glimpses of alternate versions of himself making different choices. Antonio was trapped in some kind of infinite loop, a highway system that folded back on itself in impossible ways, creating paths that led nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Antonio tried desperately to find a way out of the loop. He attempted to turn his truck around and drive back the way he'd come, but reversing direction just led him to more of the same endless highway with the same periodic exits. He tried leaving the paved road entirely, driving out into the desert scrubland. But after a few hundred yards, his truck would somehow end up back on the pavement regardless of his steering inputs, as if the road itself was a gravitational force he couldn't escape. Hours passed, or what felt like hours. Antonio's dashboard clock showed time progressing normally, advancing from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. and beyond. But the sun never changed position in the sky, remaining fixed in the same afternoon angle. Antonio's fuel gauge dropped steadily, indicating he'd burned through a significant portion of his diesel, yet his odometer showed impossible mileage accumulation, advancing thousands of miles while Antonio felt like he'd been driving in circles. Antonio tried calling for help on his cell phone, but the device showed no signal despite previously having adequate coverage in this area. His CB radio produced only static, and his GPS continued to show his truck's position as a blue dot on an empty map, with no roads displayed. The isolation was complete and terrifying. Antonio had no way to communicate with the outside world and no way to navigate out of whatever trap he'd fallen into. Then Antonio saw something different, a building beside the road, a small structure that looked like it might be a gas station or convenience store, the first sign of human construction Antonio had seen since entering this nightmare highway system. Desperate for any change in the pattern, Antonio pulled into the dirt parking lot in front of the building. The structure was old and weathered with peeling paint and broken windows, clearly abandoned for years, if not decades. But it was something other than endless highway, and Antonio felt compelled to investigate. Antonio climbed down from his truck and approached the building cautiously. The door hung open on rusted hinges, revealing a dark interior. As Antonio's eyes adjusted to the dimness, he could make out what had once been a small store with shelves and a counter, now empty and covered in dust. Graffiti covered some of the walls and debris littered the floor. Antonio was about to leave, having found nothing useful, when he noticed something written on one wall in what looked like black marker or spray paint. The message read, "The road loops forever. Only way out is to stop choosing. Let the road choose for you." The words were surrounded by tally marks, hundreds of them, as if someone had been counting days or repetitions. Below the main message were additional notes, some legible and others too faded or damaged to read clearly. Antonio made out fragments. Tried 18 exits all the same, and fuel never actually runs out. And saw myself die on exit 43. These messages suggested that Antonio wasn't the first person trapped in this looping highway system, that others had been here before him and had tried to find escape. The advice about stopping choosing and letting the road choose was cryptic, but might represent the only guidance available. Antonio took a photo of the wall with his phone's camera, even though he had no signal to send it anywhere, then returned to his truck. Antonio decided to test the theory presented in the graffiti message. Instead of making conscious choices about which exits to take or which direction to drive, he would simply respond to whatever felt intuitive or instinctive, letting his subconscious mind guide his actions rather than his rational decision-making process. It sounded like nonsense, but Antonio had no better options available. Antonio resumed driving and tried to empty his mind of conscious thought, entering an almost meditative state where he simply reacted to the road ahead without analyzing or planning. When an exit appeared, Antonio would take it or not, based purely on instinct, not considering the consequences or trying to map out where it might lead. He stopped checking his mirrors for alternate versions of himself and stopped trying to make sense of the landscape or the sun's position. He just drove, allowing the highway to dictate his path. Time became meaningless as Antonio continued this process. He might have been driving for minutes or hours or days, he had no way to know, and stopped trying to track it. The repetitive nature of the loop gradually faded, with each stretch of highway beginning to look slightly different from the previous one. The mountains in the distance started to show variation in their shapes and positions. The scrubland vegetation changed subtly, becoming more varied and realistic. Then, without any dramatic transition or clear moment of crossing a threshold, Antonio found himself on a normal highway with other vehicles visible ahead and behind him. His GPS suddenly displayed roads again, showing that he was on Highway 80, a route that ran parallel to Interstate 10 through southern New Mexico and Arizona. Antonio pulled over at the first opportunity and checked his location carefully. He was approximately 40 miles west of Lordsburg, New Mexico, having somehow covered nearly 100 miles of actual distance during his time in the loop. Antonio's clock showed 8:37 p.m., meaning approximately 6 hours had passed since he'd taken that first alternate route exit. His fuel gauge showed he'd used an appropriate amount of diesel for the distance traveled, with no evidence of the impossible mileage his odometer had displayed while he was trapped in the loop. His cargo was intact and properly secured. By all physical measures, nothing unusual had occurred except for a significant loss of time. Antonio completed his delivery to Tucson late that night, arriving nearly 4 hours behind schedule. He explained the delay by claiming he'd gotten lost on an unfamiliar detour, which was technically true if incomplete. His dispatcher was irritated but accepted the explanation, and Antonio's otherwise perfect record prevented any serious consequences from the late delivery. In the days and weeks following his experience, Antonio tried to find the exit where he'd first left Interstate 10. He drove that stretch of highway multiple times, carefully watching for the alternate route sign that had started his nightmare. He never found it. There was no exit in that location, no sign of recent construction or new roads. Other drivers Antonio questioned had never heard of any alternate routes in that area, and New Mexico Transportation Department maps showed no highways or roads where Antonio had been trapped. Antonio also searched for the abandoned building where he'd seen the graffiti messages. He drove up and down Highway 80 looking for any structure matching his memory, but found nothing. Either the building didn't exist in the normal world or it was located somewhere within the loop system itself, only accessible to those trapped in that impossible network of repeating highways. Antonio continued driving trucks professionally, but he became obsessed with documenting and researching similar experiences. He discovered that other drivers had reported getting lost on highways that shouldn't exist, driving for hours on roads that led nowhere, encountering impossible loops and repetitions. These accounts were scattered across trucker forums and paranormal websites, usually dismissed as hallucinations or stories invented for attention. But Antonio recognized the common elements: the loop structures, the alternate versions of oneself, the manipulation of time and distance, the sense of being trapped in a system that operated by incomprehensible rules. Antonio developed a theory that the highway system, at least in certain remote areas, existed in multiple layers or dimensions. Most of the time, drivers traveled on the surface layer, the normal physical roads that appeared on maps and connected real locations. But under certain conditions that Antonio couldn't identify, it was possible to slip into deeper layers, into road networks that looped back on themselves and followed different physical laws. These ghost highways existed in parallel with the real ones, occasionally intersecting at exits that appeared and disappeared without pattern or warning. The graffiti message Antonio had seen, the advice about stopping choosing and letting the road choose, made sense in the context of this theory. The loop highways responded to conscious intention, trapping people who tried to navigate them rationally. Only by surrendering control and allowing instinctive or subconscious navigation could a driver slip back out of the loop and return to the surface layer of reality. It was counterintuitive and frightening, requiring someone to give up agency and control during a moment of crisis, but it appeared to be the only escape method. Antonio started carrying a small notebook in his truck, documenting every instance of unusual road conditions or unexplained detours. He shared his experiences and theories on various online forums, connecting with other drivers who'd had similar encounters. Together, they attempted to map the locations where transitions between road layers seemed most likely to occur, identifying patterns in highway construction, geographic features, and even temporal factors like time of day or season. What Antonio and his fellow researchers discovered was disturbing. The transition points appeared to be increasing in frequency and geographic distribution. Areas that had been safe for decades were suddenly developing exits to nowhere, loops that trapped unwary drivers. It was as if the ghost highway network was expanding, growing like a cancer through the normal road system, consuming more and more of the physical infrastructure and replacing it with impossible geometries and endless repetitions. Antonio never took another alternate route or unfamiliar exit after his experience. When he encountered detour signs or alternate route suggestions that he didn't recognize or couldn't verify against his maps, he chose to continue on his planned path regardless of potential delays. He'd rather sit in traffic for hours than risk falling into another loop that might trap him for days or weeks or forever. He'd escaped once through a combination of luck and cryptic advice from a previous victim, but Antonio knew that not everyone was so fortunate. There were drivers who'd gone missing over the years, people whose trucks had simply vanished along certain stretches of highway with no accident scene or evidence of what had happened to them. Some of those drivers had probably suffered conventional fates like medical emergencies or criminal activity, but Antonio suspected that at least some had been swallowed by the ghost highway network, trapped in loops they couldn't escape, driving endlessly through landscapes that repeated forever. Those drivers were still out there in some sense, still trapped in their trucks on roads that existed sideways to reality, probably making tally marks on abandoned building walls and leaving messages for the next victims who'd follow them into the infinite loop. Antonio still drives trucks across the Southwest, still makes runs between El Paso and Tucson and all the other familiar cities and towns that define the region. But every mile of every journey carries the knowledge that the road beneath his wheels might suddenly twist into something else, that any exit could lead into a system from which there might be no return. The highway infrastructure that connects America and enables commerce and travel, that web of asphalt and concrete that seems so solid and permanent, is actually far more fragile and far more strange than most people realize. There are gaps in the network, places where the roads fold, back on themselves or lead into dimensions that operate by alien rules. Antonio found one of those places and managed to escape, but he knows that countless others exist, waiting for the next driver who makes the fatal mistake of taking an unfamiliar exit, trusting a new sign, choosing an alternate route that promises to save time but delivers only endless repetition, and the slow realization that the road has claimed another victim, another soul to drive its impossible highways forever. Story 6. The Voice on the Radio. Patricia Hayes had been driving commercial trucks for 26 years, making her one of the most experienced drivers working out of the Chicago area. At 53 years old, she'd built a career on reliability and professionalism, hauling everything from perishable goods to hazardous materials across the country. Patricia was known for her calm demeanor under pressure and her ability to handle difficult situations without panic. She'd driven through blizzards that shut down entire highways, had talked down aggressive drivers threatening road rage, and had once kept her truck under control when a tire blowout occurred at 70 miles per hour. Very little rattled Patricia, and she prided herself on that unshakable composure. On a cold November night in 2022, Patricia was hauling a load of electronics from a distribution center outside Chicago to a retail warehouse in Nashville, Tennessee. The route took her south through Illinois and Indiana before cutting across Kentucky to reach Tennessee, a journey she'd made dozens of times over her career. Patricia had departed Chicago around 8 p.m., planning to drive through the night and arrive in Nashville by mid-morning the following day. The weather was clear and cold, with temperatures in the low 30s, perfect conditions for making good time. Patricia's truck was equipped with both a modern commercial radio for communication with dispatch and other drivers, and an older CB radio that Patricia maintained for the camaraderie and information sharing that happened on the trucker channels. She typically kept the CB tuned to Channel 19, the unofficial truckers channel where drivers shared information about traffic conditions, speed traps, and good places to stop for fuel or food. The chatter on Channel 19 could be entertaining or annoying depending on who was talking, but it helped pass the time during long stretches of monotonous highway driving. Around 10:30 p.m., as Patricia crossed into Indiana on Interstate 65, she began hearing an unusual broadcast on her CB radio. A man's voice, speaking in a calm and measured tone, was describing a highway accident in detail. The voice explained that a truck carrying chemicals had jackknifed on a bridge, that multiple vehicles were involved, that there were casualties, and that the highway would be closed for hours. The voice provided specific mile marker information, indicating the accident was approximately 30 miles ahead of Patricia's current position. Patricia immediately checked her GPS and commercial radio for confirmation of this accident. Her GPS showed no traffic delays or incidents ahead, and her commercial radio was receiving normal dispatches with no mention of any major accident. Patricia found this discrepancy odd, but not alarming. Sometimes CB radio operators received information faster than official channels, especially if the accident was very recent. Patricia decided to stay alert and watch for signs of the reported incident as she approached the indicated location. The voice on Channel 19 continued describing the accident scene in increasingly graphic detail. It described the chemical truck's cargo as corrosive material that was leaking onto the roadway, creating a hazardous situation. It described emergency responders struggling to contain the spill while trying to extract injured drivers from crushed vehicles. The level of detail was extraordinary, almost as if the person broadcasting was standing at the scene observing everything directly. Patricia called out on Channel 19, asking who was providing the accident information and where they were getting their details. Her transmission received no response. The voice simply continued its description, now moving on to explain how traffic was being diverted to alternate routes and which exits drivers should take to avoid the closure. Patricia tried again, identifying herself and asking for confirmation of the accident location. Again, no response. The voice didn't acknowledge her transmissions at all, just continued its steady narration. As Patricia approached the mile marker where the accident had supposedly occurred, she saw no signs of any incident. No emergency vehicle lights, no traffic backup, no vehicles at all except for normal traffic flowing smoothly in both directions. Patricia passed directly through the area where the broadcast had indicated a major accident was blocking the highway and found nothing but clear road. She keyed her microphone and pointed this out, stating that she was at the reported location and there was no accident. The voice responded for the first time. Not yet, but soon. Very soon now. You should have taken the exit. You should have avoided this area. It's too late now. The tone was no longer calm and informative, but carried an edge of something that might have been satisfaction or anticipation. Patricia felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the November cold. Patricia tried switching her CB to different channels, but the voice followed her, appearing on every channel she selected. Channel 9, Channel 17, Channel 28. Everywhere Patricia tuned the radio, the voice was there, now silent except for occasional statements like, "Any moment now," and "Watch the road ahead," and "You should have listened when you had the chance." Patricia considered turning the CB radio off entirely, but something compelled her to keep listening, a morbid fascination with what the voice was predicting. Then Patricia saw lights ahead, red and blue emergency lights flashing in the distance. Her heart sank. As she got closer, she could see that there had indeed been an accident, and it looked serious. A semi-truck was jackknifed across multiple lanes with several cars involved in what appeared to be a multi-vehicle collision. Emergency responders were on scene, their vehicles blocking much of the highway. Traffic was being directed to squeeze past on the shoulder while the wreckage was cleared. Patricia's hands trembled on the steering wheel as she carefully navigated past the accident scene. She could see that the jackknifed truck had hazmat placards indicating chemical cargo, exactly as the voice had described. Emergency personnel in protective suits were working near the truck's trailer, suggesting there was indeed a leak or spill situation. Everything the voice had described was accurate, but it had described the accident before it happened, providing details of an event that was still in the future when the broadcast began. The voice on the radio spoke again as Patricia cleared the accident scene. "You see, I told you it was coming. I always know. I can see what's ahead on the road, all the accidents waiting to happen, all the terrible things coming. And I'm going to tell you about another one now, Patricia. Yes, I know your name. I know everything about you. And I know what's waiting for you further down this highway. Patricia's blood turned to ice. The voice had used her name, something she definitely hadn't broadcast on the radio. How could it know who she was? Patricia grabbed her CB microphone and demanded to know who was speaking, what they wanted, how they knew her name. The voice chuckled, a sound that carried no warmth or humor. I'm just a voice on the radio, Patricia. I've been here for a very long time, riding along with drivers like you, watching the road, seeing the future unfold. Sometimes I warn people, give them a chance to avoid what's coming. Sometimes I just watch and narrate. It depends on my mood, the voice continued. In 63 miles, there's going to be another accident. Not as bad as the chemical spill you just passed, but bad enough. A car is going to cross the median, drunk driver who can't stay in his lane. He's going to hit a pickup truck head-on, and both drivers will die instantly. It's going to happen right at mile marker 187 in approximately 48 minutes from now. You could prevent it, Patricia. You could call the highway patrol, report a dangerous driver, get them to intercept the drunk before he causes the accident. Or you could just keep driving and let it happen. What do you think? Do you want to be a hero, or do you want to see if I'm right again? Patricia immediately grabbed her cell phone and dialed 911, reporting that she'd heard about a potentially dangerous driver on Interstate 65 heading southbound. The dispatcher asked for more specific information, and Patricia realized she had nothing concrete to report. She couldn't explain that a voice on her CB radio that could apparently see the future had warned her about an accident that hadn't happened yet. The dispatcher's tone became skeptical, clearly wondering if Patricia was making a prank call or experiencing some kind of mental health crisis. Patricia ended the call without providing her name, knowing her report sounded insane and probably wouldn't result in any action. Patricia drove on, her eyes constantly checking the road ahead, watching for any sign of a drunk driver or dangerous vehicle. She noted when she passed mile marker 187 the location where the voice had predicted the accident would occur. Nothing happened immediately. Patricia began to hope that maybe the voice had been wrong, that its prediction wouldn't come true. But approximately 10 minutes after she passed mile marker 187, Patricia saw emergency lights in her rearview mirror, back at that exact location. She'd been ahead of the accident, had passed through before it occurred, but it had happened exactly as the voice described. You could have stopped it, the voice said, its tone carrying mock disappointment. You had the information, you had the time, but you didn't know how to convince anyone to act. That's always the problem, isn't it? Knowledge without the ability to make others believe you. How frustrating that must be. Patricia wanted to scream at the voice, to curse at it for playing these games, but she forced herself to stay calm. Getting emotional wouldn't help, and the voice clearly fed on reactions. What do you want? Patricia asked, keeping her voice as steady as possible. Why are you doing this? What's the point of telling me about accidents if I can't prevent them? The voice took its time responding, letting silence stretch uncomfortably before answering. Want? I don't want anything, Patricia, I just am. I exist in the radio waves, in the static between stations, riding along with you drivers as you cross the country. I've been here since the first radio transmissions started carrying voices through the air. I found I could slip into those signals, use them to communicate, to observe, and what I observe most clearly is disaster. Accidents, breakdowns, moments of crisis and death. They shine so brightly in the future, like beacons I can see from miles and hours away. The voice paused, then continued. I tell people because I'm curious about what they'll do with the knowledge. Some drivers ignore me, think I'm just some prankster or that they're hallucinating. Some try to prevent the accidents I describe and fail. Some succeed in changing things, though not as often as you'd think. The future is stubborn, Patricia. It doesn't like being altered. When someone tries to prevent an accident I've foreseen, sometimes they just create a different accident, or delay the inevitable, or make things worse in unexpected ways. The road has its hunger, and it will be fed one way or another. Patricia drove in silence for several miles, processing what the voice had told her. If it was telling the truth, it was some kind of entity that existed in radio transmissions that could perceive future events, specifically disasters and accidents. It told people about what was coming, not to help them, but to observe their reactions, to see what they'd do with foreknowledge of tragedy. It was cruel and pointless, a game played by something that didn't value human life or suffering. "I'm going to turn my radio off," Patricia said firmly. "I don't want to hear any more of your predictions. I don't want to participate in whatever sick game you're playing." The voice laughed again, that empty, cold sound. "You can turn off the radio, Patricia, but that won't make me go away. I'm already in your head now, in your thoughts. You'll hear me whether the radio is on or not. And besides, don't you want to know what I see in your own future? Don't you want to know what's waiting for you?" Patricia's hand hovered over the CB radio's power switch. Part of her desperately wanted to shut the device off, to silence the voice and everything it represented. But another part of her was paralyzed by curiosity and fear. What if the voice really could see her future? What if there was something terrible waiting for her and the voice could warn her in time to avoid it? Patricia's hand dropped away from the power switch. She hated herself for the weakness, but she couldn't bring herself to turn off the radio. "That's what I thought," the voice said, satisfaction evident in its tone. "Nobody can resist. The temptation to know what's coming is too strong. Even though most of my predictions involve other people's tragedies, there's always the hope that I'll tell you something about yourself, something you can use to stay safe. But here's the truth, Patricia. I don't see anything bad in your immediate future. You're going to complete this delivery without incident. You'll arrive in Nashville safely, unload your cargo, and go on to your next job. Your future is boringly ordinary for at least the next several days." The voice paused, then added, "But I'll be with you for all of it, riding along on your radio, watching through your speakers, whispering about all the disasters happening around you. Every accident you pass, every emergency vehicle you see, I'll have told you about it first. You'll start to depend on my warnings, listening for them, anticipating them. And gradually you'll realize that you can't distinguish between my voice and your own thoughts anymore. I'll have become part of you, Patricia, a permanent passenger you can never remove." Patricia did try to turn off the CB radio then, finally overcoming her paralysis and slapping the power switch. The radio's lights went dark, and the speaker fell silent. Patricia felt a moment of relief, but it was short-lived, because she could still hear the voice, not coming from the radio anymore, but from inside her own head, indistinguishable from her own thoughts. The voice was right. It had gotten inside her mind, had become part of her internal dialogue, and no amount of turning off external devices would silence it now. For the rest of the journey to Nashville, Patricia heard the voice predicting accidents and disasters. Sometimes the predictions were accurate, and Patricia would pass the scene of an incident the voice had described. Other times, nothing happened at the predicted locations, and Patricia couldn't tell if the voice had been wrong or if somehow the predicted accident had been avoided. The voice provided running commentary on everything, analyzing Patricia's thoughts and reactions, mocking her attempts to ignore it, promising that it would never leave. Patricia completed her delivery to Nashville in the early morning hours, then immediately drove to a hospital rather than picking up her next load. She explained to a doctor that she was experiencing auditory hallucinations, hearing a voice that wouldn't stop talking. The doctor was concerned and recommended immediate psychiatric evaluation. Patricia spent 3 days in a hospital undergoing tests and evaluations, being prescribed antipsychotic medications that made her feel disconnected and foggy but did nothing to silence the voice. The voice found her hospital stay amusing, providing commentary on the doctors and their futile attempts to treat what they thought was a conventional mental illness. "They can't help you," the voice told Patricia. "They're looking for chemical imbalances and brain abnormalities, but I'm not a symptom of disease. I'm a separate entity that's chosen to share your consciousness. Their medications might dull your mind, but they won't evict me. I'm here until I decide to leave, and I'm quite comfortable, thank you." Patricia was eventually released from the hospital with a diagnosis of acute stress-induced psychosis and a prescription for medications she was supposed to take daily. She returned to work, but driving had become torture. The voice continued its endless narration, predicting accidents, analyzing Patricia's psychological state, sometimes just rambling about its own existence and the things it had observed over decades of riding radio waves. Patricia tried various methods to cope: medication, meditation, therapy, even consulting with a priest about potential possession. Nothing helped. The voice's predictions did sometimes prove useful. Patricia would hear about accidents or hazards before she reached them, giving her time to slow down or take alternate routes. Other drivers started commenting on Patricia's seemingly supernatural ability to avoid problems, to always know when trouble was ahead. But the benefit wasn't worth the cost. Patricia was slowly being driven insane by the constant presence of the voice in her mind, the never-ending stream of predictions and commentary that gave her no peace or privacy. 6 months after the voice first appeared on her CB radio, Patricia quit trucking entirely. She took a job at a warehouse near her home, working as a logistics coordinator, a position that kept her off the highways and out of trucks. The voice faded gradually after she stopped driving, becoming quieter and less frequent until it was just an occasional whisper rather than a constant presence. Patricia isn't sure if the entity actually left or if it's just dormant, waiting for her to get behind the wheel of a truck again so it can resume its games. Patricia never turned on a CB radio again, and she avoids even commercial radio in her personal vehicle, preferring to drive in silence or listen to music from her phone through the car's Bluetooth connection. She's terrified that any radio communication might provide a pathway for the voice to return, to once again take up residence in her consciousness and subject her to its endless predictions of disaster and tragedy. She's researched her experience and found scattered reports from other truckers who claim to have encountered similar phenomena. Voices on the radio that predicted accidents, entities that rode along in their trucks and invaded their thoughts, presences that couldn't be escaped or silenced once they'd made contact. Patricia believes now that the radio spectrum is inhabited by things that aren't human, entities that exist in the electromagnetic transmissions that carry our communications. Most of them are probably benign or indifferent to humanity, but some, like the voice she encountered, are malevolent or at least callously unconcerned with human suffering. They observe disasters and sometimes warn people not out of compassion but out of curiosity or cruelty, wanting to see how people will react to foreknowledge of tragedy. The highways remain dangerous not just because of weather and mechanical failures and human error, but because they're watched by things that can see the future and choose selectively what to reveal. Drivers who hear unusual broadcasts on their radios, voices that seem to know too much or predict events that haven't happened yet, might be receiving warnings from these entities. But accepting those warnings comes with a price: the possibility that the voice will never leave, that it will become a permanent psychological parasite feeding on fear and uncertainty. Patricia paid that price and barely escaped with her sanity intact. She knows that countless other drivers probably haven't been so fortunate, that they're still out there driving the highways with voices in their heads, permanent passengers that predict every disaster, narrate every tragedy, and slowly drive their unwilling hosts toward madness, one predicted accident at a time. Story 7. The Fog-Bound Delivery. Michael Torres had been driving trucks for 8 years, having entered the profession at age 30 after a career in construction left him with chronic back problems that made physical labor increasingly difficult. At 38, Michael had found trucking to be a good fit for his personality and circumstances, providing decent income without the physical demands of his previous work. He drove for a regional carrier based out of Portland, Oregon, primarily hauling goods along the Interstate 5 corridor between Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. Michael preferred the Pacific Northwest for its scenery and relatively mild climate, and he'd developed expertise in mountain driving and navigating the sometimes challenging weather conditions of the region. On a late October evening in 2021, Michael picked up a load of computer servers and networking equipment from a technology company's distribution center in Portland. The cargo was valuable and sensitive, requiring careful handling and climate control during transport. Michael's destination was a data center in Redding, California, approximately 400 miles south, a journey that would take him through the mountains of southern Oregon and northern California along Interstate 5. The route included the challenging Siskiyou Summit, a mountain pass with steep grades and tight curves that required caution even in good weather. Michael departed Portland around 6 p.m., planning to drive through the night and arrive in Redding by early morning. The October weather forecast showed clear conditions for most of the route, with some possibility of fog in the mountain areas, but nothing unusual for this time of year. Michael had driven this route dozens of times and was comfortable with the challenges it presented. He'd loaded the trailer carefully, ensuring his valuable cargo was properly secured and that the climate control system was maintaining the required temperature and humidity levels. The first few hours of driving proceeded normally. Michael passed through Eugene and Roseburg without incident, making good time as he headed south toward the California border. Around 10 p.m., as Michael began climbing into the Siskiyou Mountains, he encountered the first wisps of fog drifting across the highway. Mountain fog was common in this area, particularly during autumn evenings when temperature inversions trapped moisture in the valleys and passes. Michael reduced his speed appropriately and turned on his fog lights, preparing for reduced visibility through the summit area. The fog thickened rapidly as Michael climbed higher into the mountains. Within 15 minutes, visibility had dropped to less than 100 feet, with Michael's headlights reflecting off the dense white vapor that surrounded his truck. This level of fog was more severe than Michael had anticipated based on the weather forecast, but not unprecedented in this area. He slowed further, keeping his speed below 40 miles per hour and watching carefully for the reflectors marking the road's edge and center line. Other vehicles became invisible except when Michael was directly behind them, their taillights suddenly appearing as dim red glows in the fog only when they were dangerously close. Michael gave extra following distance to account for the poor visibility, and he could sense other drivers around him doing the same, everyone moving cautiously through the thick fog. The radio began reporting that the fog was affecting a significant stretch of Interstate 5 through the mountains, causing multiple vehicles to pull over and wait for conditions to improve. Michael considered stopping as well, but he was already approaching the summit, the highest point of the pass. Once he crested the summit and began descending the southern side, he should drop below the fog layer and regain normal visibility. Michael decided to continue slowly rather than stopping, confident in his ability to handle reduced visibility driving. He'd been through worse conditions during winter storms, and fog, while challenging, was manageable with proper caution and speed control. As Michael reached what his GPS indicated was the summit area, something changed about the fog. It became denser, almost solid-looking. No longer the wispy white vapor of normal fog, but something thicker and more substantial. The fog seemed to have texture with darker swirls and patterns moving through it. Michael's headlights barely penetrated a few feet into the murk, creating a claustrophobic tunnel of visibility that made driving feel like moving through a white void. Then Michael realized he could no longer see any other vehicles. No taillights ahead, no headlights approaching from the opposite direction, no signs of any other traffic on the highway. He grabbed his CB radio and called out, asking if any other drivers were in the area or experiencing the extreme fog conditions. Only static answered him, heavy and crackling, as if something was interfering with the radio signal. Michael tried his cell phone and found it showed no signal despite previously having adequate coverage in this area. Michael continued driving, following the highway's path through the fog by watching the reflectors marking the road edge. But he began to notice something disturbing. The reflectors were becoming further apart, their spacing irregular, and sometimes they seemed to be at the wrong angle or position for the highway Michael knew he was on. Several times, Michael could swear he saw reflectors that appeared to be floating several feet above the ground rather than mounted at road level. Michael's GPS started malfunctioning, showing his truck's position jumping erratically around the map, sometimes placing him miles off the highway or in locations that made no sense. The device would work normally for a few seconds, then glitch and reset, displaying wildly incorrect information before correcting again. Michael couldn't rely on the GPS to confirm his position or verify he was still on the correct road. He was navigating purely by following what he hoped was the highway, trusting the reflectors and the feel of the pavement beneath his wheels. The fog began to change color. Instead of the white or gray of normal fog, it took on a yellowish tinge, then a sickly green. Then colors that Michael had no names for, hues that shouldn't exist in nature and that hurt to look at directly. The swirling patterns in the fog became more pronounced, forming shapes that almost looked like figures or faces before dissolving back into formless mist. Michael's eyes watered from staring into the strange colors, and he began to feel a headache building behind his temples. Then Michael heard sounds from outside his truck. Not the normal sounds of the highway, but other things. Voices calling out in the fog, shouting words Michael couldn't quite make out. Footsteps on pavement, dozens of feet walking in different directions, invisible in the dense fog but clearly audible. Music playing somewhere in the distance, a melody that sounded vaguely familiar but distorted and wrong. The sounds created the impression that Michael was driving through a populated area, a town or city. Despite knowing he was supposed to be on a remote mountain highway with nothing but forest surrounding the road, Michael's truck began to behave strangely. The engine sound changed pitch, running rougher than normal, and the transmission seemed to struggle with shifts that should have been smooth. The steering felt heavy and unresponsive, requiring more effort than usual to make corrections. Michael checked his gauges and warning lights, but everything showed normal readings. The mechanical issues seemed real enough, yet the instruments indicated his truck was functioning perfectly. Michael had been driving through the impossible fog for what felt like hours, though his dashboard clock showed only 30 minutes had passed since entering the summit area. He should have descended below the fog layer by now. Should be approaching the Siskiyou rest area on the southern side of the pass. Instead, he was still enveloped in the dense, color-shifting fog, still following reflectors that appeared and disappeared unpredictably. Still hearing those impossible sounds of invisible people moving through the murk around his truck. Then Michael's headlights picked out a figure standing directly in the road ahead. A person, apparently a man based on the build and posture, standing motionless facing Michael's approaching truck. Michael braked hard, his truck shuddering to a stop approximately 20 feet from the figure. Michael sat frozen, watching the figure through his windshield. The person was wearing old-fashioned clothing, what looked like a military uniform from decades past, maybe from World War II or earlier based on the style Michael could make out through the fog. The figure raised one arm and pointed to the right, gesturing off the highway. Michael looked in the direction indicated and saw what appeared to be a side road or exit, barely visible through the fog. The figure continued pointing, its gesture emphatic and insistent. Michael had no idea what road or exit this could be, as his knowledge of this highway section didn't include any significant intersections near the summit. But the figure clearly wanted Michael to turn off the highway. Michael hesitated, uncertain whether to trust this apparition or continue straight ahead on what he hoped was still Interstate 5. The figure lowered its arm and began walking toward Michael's truck, moving with a strange, gliding motion that didn't look quite natural. As it got closer, Michael could see that the uniform was soaked with something dark that might have been blood, and the figure's face, when it came into range of Michael's headlights, was gray and lifeless, the face of a corpse that was somehow still mobile. Michael made a snap decision and cranked his steering wheel hard to the right, taking his truck off the highway and onto whatever road or path the figure had indicated. He accelerated away from the ghostly soldier, his truck bouncing over uneven pavement as Michael fled. In his mirrors, Michael could see the figure standing where he'd left it, watching his truck disappear into the fog but not pursuing. The side road Michael had taken was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for his truck to navigate. The pavement was cracked and broken, with weeds growing through the gaps. This definitely wasn't a maintained highway or even a legitimate side road. Michael had taken his truck onto what appeared to be an abandoned access road or possibly a remnant of an older highway that had been superseded when Interstate 5 was built. But the road was going downhill, descending from the summit area, which was what Michael desperately wanted. If he could just get below the fog layer, he could find his way back to the interstate and escape this nightmare. Michael drove for what his clock indicated was another 20 minutes, though his sense of time had become so distorted he couldn't trust the measurement. The abandoned road continued its winding descent through the fog, which gradually began to thin. Michael could see further ahead, make out the shapes of trees flanking the road, sense that he was approaching the edge of the fog layer. He pushed his speed higher, desperate to break free into clear air. Then the fog ended abruptly, and Michael emerged into a normal autumn night with clear skies and stars visible overhead. He'd escaped the impossible fog at the summit, but Michael had no idea where he was. The narrow road had delivered him into a valley or canyon, with steep hillsides visible on both sides. No signs indicated what road this was or which direction led to civilization. Michael's GPS was still malfunctioning, unable to establish his location or display useful mapping information. Michael continued following the road, trusting that any descending path would eventually lead to lower elevations and populated areas where he could reorient himself. After approximately 30 minutes of driving through the darkness, Michael's headlights picked out a sign ahead. "Welcome to Weed, California." Michael almost laughed with relief. Weed was a small town on Interstate 5, approximately 15 miles south of the summit. He'd somehow navigated through the fog and the abandoned roads and arrived within a few miles of where he should have been all along. Michael drove into Weed and pulled into the first truck stop he found, needing to stop and process what he'd experienced. He walked around his truck, performing a thorough inspection. The vehicle looked normal except for being covered in dust and small scratches, as if it had been driven through brush or overgrown areas. Michael's trailer showed similar wear, with vegetation marks and dirt streaking the sides. But the cargo inside was undisturbed and the climate control system had continued functioning throughout the entire ordeal. Michael went into the truck stop and asked the clerk if there had been reports of unusual fog conditions in the summit area. The clerk looked at him with confusion, saying that the weather had been clear all evening with no fog reported anywhere in the region. Michael checked his phone and found multiple missed calls from his dispatcher, worried because Michael had gone offline for over 3 hours with no communication. According to the phone's call log and his truck's electronic logs, Michael had lost over 3 hours that he couldn't account for with normal driving time through the summit area. Michael completed his delivery to Reading later that morning, but he filed a report with his company explaining that he'd experienced disorientation and lost time during the summit crossing. The company ordered Michael to undergo a medical evaluation concerned he might have experienced a seizure or some other medical event that caused gaps in his memory. The evaluation found nothing wrong, and Michael was cleared to return to driving, but the incident remained in his personnel file. Michael never drove through Siskiyou Summit at night again. He scheduled his routes to cross during daylight hours, or he took alternate paths that avoided the summit entirely, even if they added significant time to his journeys. Because Michael knows what he experienced in that impossible fog. The colors that shouldn't exist, the sounds of invisible people, the ghostly soldier in the blood-stained uniform pointing toward an escape route that appeared and disappeared like a dream. Michael researched the Siskiyou Summit area afterward and discovered it had a long history of unexplained phenomena. The summit area had been the site of numerous accidents over the years, far more than statistics suggested should occur on that particular stretch of highway. There were reports of drivers seeing apparitions, hearing unexplained sounds, experiencing lost time, and encountering fog conditions that didn't match weather forecasts or observations from nearby areas. Some researchers speculated that the summit existed at a thin point in reality, a location where the barrier between our world and other dimensions was fragile and sometimes fractured, allowing things to slip through. The ghostly soldier Michael had seen might have been a victim of one of the many accidents that had occurred in the summit area over the decades, or it might have been something older, a remnant from the days before the modern highway when this was a dangerous mountain pass crossed by horse-drawn wagons and early automobiles. The figure had shown Michael an escape route, had gestured toward the path that would lead below the fog and back to normal reality. Whether it was trying to help or simply directing Michael along a predetermined path, Michael would never know. Michael still drives trucks through the Pacific Northwest, still makes deliveries along Interstate 5 and the other highways that connect the region. But he carries the knowledge that some places along those routes exist in multiple layers of reality, that under certain conditions travelers can slip between layers and find themselves navigating roads that don't quite belong to our world. The fog that sometimes blankets mountain passes might be more than just condensed water vapor, might be a barrier or threshold that separates the normal world from places where different rules apply, and where the dead or the never-living walk roads that mirror our highways, but lead to destinations no map can show. Michael was fortunate to find his way back, guided by a ghost soldier and an abandoned road that somehow delivered him to safety despite not existing on any map. But he knows that others probably haven't been so lucky, that some of the missing persons and unexplained disappearances associated with that summit area represent travelers who entered the fog-bound layers and never found their way out, who are still driving through impossible mist and following reflectors that float in empty air, searching for exits that never appear and listening to the sounds of invisible crowds moving through the eternal fog, trapped between worlds on a highway that exists everywhere and nowhere, condemned to drive forever through the summit that never ends.